There we go. So today we're going to be talking about resonance. So, resonance is generally considered a more advanced writing concept, but it's only considered to be more advanced because of the fact that most people focus on character and plot, and that's it. Resonance is something where you look at the overarching story and you say, hey, how can I make my characters more powerful? How can I make my plot more powerful using resonance? Now, to define resonance, resonance is when something throughout the book or movie, whatever media is your choice, is repeated again and again and given emotional meaning or a mirror meaning. A great example of this is in the musical Hamilton. The song Burn is a fantastic mirror image song because of the fact that the whole thing is talking about, write like you're running out of time. You gotta write. Your words are so important. The future is so important. What you have to write to tell the future is so important. And basically she says in vengeance, no, I'm going to burn all of your precious words and say, no, I'm not going to write. I'm not going to tell people what they thought. I'm not going to tell people what I thought because it doesn't matter. They don't need to know. They don't need to pry into our lives. Your writing is more important than me. And the reason that's so powerful and impactful is because the whole story is about Hamilton and his words and his drive to make powerful words and change the world with words. And here she is saying, you don't need words to change the world. In fact, my lack of words will change the world. And so it's a completely opposite message, right? But that's what gives it the oomph, that's what makes you go, in emotional screaming. And you want that with a story. You want that resonance that makes people go, whoa, that hit me hard. And it can be a theme, it can be a character development like this, it can be a plot piece. There's so many different aspects to resonance and how to make it work. This is just one of the very many. Alright, so we're going to talk about some ways to create this resonance and the recommendations that I would have for working on resonance, because as I said, it is a pretty complex concept, because generally when you're writing something, you're focused on, is my character good? Is the plot good? Are there plot holes? You're not focused on, how do I make my reader feel like they were just punched in the face with emotion? That's generally a third or even fourth goal down the line. It's a revision goal, not a current goal. But you can make it a current goal. It's a lot easier than people give it credit for once you actually put it on the forefront of your mind. The problem is most people don't worry about it. And I understand why. Like I said, character and plot are so important that it kind of takes up your whole brain and you forget that resonance exists. So, how do we work on this? First, we're going to talk about plot themes. There are so many different kinds of resonance. Plot themes are generally the first type. So with plot themes, you're going to see things like with Hamilton, where it's almost every song is about writing, right? Almost every song is about the emotions evoked because of writing. As a result, that has become a plot theme. You can also do alternative plot themes. For example, you could have someone who becomes the villain in the end, right? And so the overarching plot theme is this kind of ominous obsession with fire, and then in the end they become an arsonist. I don't know, just a suggestion. So those general plot themes not only help foreshadow the ending, but then can turn everything on its head with regards to how that ending is accomplished and achieved. Now, I know that Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is new, so I won't spoil it, but this is a great example of a plot theme, if you have read it or watched it. Because of the fact that his goal, Coriolanus' goal, at the beginning of the novel/movie, is completely different than his goal at the end. They look almost the same, but the difference is his motive. Getting there and how you get there is important, but why you get there is also important. You could have a goal throughout the entire novel that this person wants to be a ballerina, and that's an admirable, cool goal. Go for it. But maybe their original goal to be a ballerina was because they wanted to make their mom proud, and then by the end, I don't know, they've done so many things to make their mom not proud that they feel like the only reason they're here is to be famous. the goal has changed and warped and shifted. The change of the goal is also going to help delineate who the character has become. Because your character should not, especially if they're a main character, stay the same. If they're like, I am an adorable floof at the beginning, and then they go through all this traumatic experiences and they're still innocent small, that doesn't make any sense, right? After you've gone through all those traumatic experiences, or if you've done a whole bunch of crazy psychotic stuff, it's going to change you.
Already like that?
If they're already a psycho, they're still going to have a character arc. They're still going to change. It's just a question of in what direction. If they go more psychotic, that could also be a different direction. They could start out as just like, I'm not a terribly great person, and then by the end they're a serial killer. That's still a character arc. It's just in a darker direction. You can also go with, if they start out as a serial killer, they could start out as a serial killer and then slowly become even worse as a serial killer, or become even more psychotic, or rediscover their reasoning for becoming a serial killer. All of those definitely show character growth. You need to show character growth whether in a good direction or a bad direction. Characters are going to grow whether or not it is positive. Thank you for pointing that out. It is not always a positive character growth, like with Coriolanus Snow in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. He is not a good person by the end. He's not. But at the same time, he wasn't a terribly good person to begin with either. He wasn't a bad person, but he wasn't a terribly good person either. But by the end, you're just like, oh, okay, buddy.
Well, what if it's like alluded to, you know? Like, what if it's vague with the this character's moral, like, how basically they are? Like, you're going through, like, you know, maybe something's wrong with this person, but you really can't say, so.
Again, you just want to make sure you show character growth, whatever that growth looks like. Because there is going to be change and growth. If your character is stagnant, it will be boring to read. You want to make sure that they change somehow, whether it's for good, whether it's for bad, whether it's you don't know what their morals are and by the end you know they're a terrible person, or you don't know what their morals are and by the end you figure out they're more morally gray, where they'll do some bad things in the name of doing good. That's still character growth. You're still learning and discovering more about the character. If the character is exactly the same way they are at the beginning as they are at the end, that's boring. It's called a flat character. That's not interesting. That's just a person. However, we want to see this person change, whether, like I said, whether or not it's good or bad. And if you don't know their morals at the beginning, I would say that's definitely a good start to a morally gray character. Now the question with morally gray is, do they become morally gray hero or morally gray villain? Because you can go either way. You can start with gray morals. You can start with, like, maybe they shouldn't have stabbed that person, but also they were trying to kill someone.
One thing I tend to say about morally gray is that it's subjective, you know?
It is pretty subjective, yes. But you still have them change as a person because of the fact that they are the main character. If they're a side character, that's fine. If they're the villain, they don't have to change, that's fine. But if they're the main character, they should undergo some sort of change, whether that's positive or negative. Just because of the fact that it is more interesting to read and makes them more three-dimensional. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it is very subjective, for sure. For example, a lot of people think that Batman is a great villain, is a great hero, but a lot of people also think he's kind of psychotic sometimes in the way he goes about things, right? He's not exactly what I'd call the most, straight-laced hero. That's more of the Flash, right? The Flash is like, hey, I'm a good person and I put people in jail in like the nicest way possible. Whereas Batman's like, I will punch them 5 million times and then they will go to jail. Some people are like, hey, that's perfectly fine. They deserve to be punched 5 million times. And then there are other people who are like, could you maybe stop punching them? So like you said, it is subjective. But at the same time, even if their morals are subjective, I'm not talking about morality here, I'm talking about them as a character. Even if your morals are subjective, you are still going to change as a person. And you don't necessarily have to stay on the good or stay on the bad side, but you have to change somehow. Because of the fact that that is what makes a good main character, is that they are compelling enough to keep reading because you're curious about where they're going, who they will become. And even if they stay the same, they can still change. For example, I've been watching a show about a pair of morally gray characters recently, and this pair of morally gray characters go from being like, hey, we are assassins because of the fact that we're going to, just do this as a job, to becoming like, we are actually scary people. Because they started as like, I've never killed a person, but I want to be an assassin, to I have killed people now, and I am actually an assassin, and I've actually done things and seen things that maybe I shouldn't have done and shouldn't have seen. So that still changed them. They were still morally gray in the beginning. I mean, who wants to become an assassin unless you're morally gray, right? And they're still morally gray at the end because you're not sure whether or not what they're doing is good or bad. But at the same time, they've changed as a person because they went from, I don't know how to kill a person, to, I know how, and I killed very many people. That is still a drastic change, even though their morally grayness has stayed pretty much the same. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Good mention about that. So with back to plot themes. With plot themes, you want to make sure that your character is driving the plot just as much as your plot is driving the plot. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, like I was saying, that the character has some sort of change. They have some sort of arc that they're going through. The person they were at the beginning of the goal is not the same person they are at the end goal. They have morphed somehow. Not all parts of them have to have changed, just one part of them. Like I said with Coriolanus Snow, he has not entirely changed as a person. He is the same person as he was at the beginning. But his goals and mentality regarding those goals has changed completely. And that's what makes it so interesting, is the fact that they have not changed as a whole, but they have changed pieces of them. Pieces of them have broken or shifted or changed. You also want to make sure that your plot, though, also drives the character. You want to make sure that the character isn't just going, I'm going to the left now. There has to be a reason they're going to the left. Maybe the plot says, hey, if you go to the left, then your girlfriend won't die. And then the person's like, yeah, I want to go that direction. So make sure that the plot is guiding them along, but make sure that the character is also guiding their own decisions. Make it equal parts. If your character feels too much like the plot's just shoving them around, that's not going to be terribly interesting. However, if the character just feels like, I can change the whole world based on whether I turn left right now, that's a little too much power. That's a little too much power for the character. So make sure that your plot themes help direct the goal of the book. And hey, maybe you don't know the end goal of the book. Maybe that's something, again, you have to worry about in a second or third draft. No one's first draft is perfect. It's one of my favorite things to say, but I like saying it because I think it really nails the point. Your first draft will never be perfect, and if you meet someone whose first draft is perfect, they are either lying to you or practicing witchcraft, because there's absolutely no way that you can have a perfect first draft. So these are more just things to think about. Don't necessarily stress over them. Don't think like, if I don't do this, I'm going to be a terrible author. Not true. Most authors struggle a lot. It is not normal, actually, to be perfect. That is actually scary. All right, next we're going to talk about emotional emphasis. So, emotional emphasis typically comes from the main character, but it can also come from what the main character goes through. For example, if your main character becomes a psychopath, then there's going to be a lot of emotional emphasis on how they feel about people, right? And killing people, probably. Whereas if your goal for the story is that they start out pretty dang okay, and then they slowly get more and more corrupted, that's going to be a character-based emotional emphasis. A great example of kind of a character changing, but still saying the same in an emotional emphasis way, and is a great example of resonance. I'm just gonna, if you guys haven't watched Hunger Games, I'm sorry, it's been long enough, I feel like I'm going to just say it. Not the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but the original series. Katniss starts out as being a pretty normal person. Yes, she sneaks out every once in a while to hunt for her family, but who wouldn't if they were starving to death? she's a pretty normal person. And then after the Hunger Games, she slowly realizes that not only has she been through so much, but she doesn't really know who she is anymore. Is she a good person? Is she a bad person? She's not even really sure. All she knows is that she wants all of this hurting of people to stop. All she knows is that this is crazy. Whatever the Capitol's doing is nuts. It's just bonkers. But another great example of emotional resonance is that Katniss, from the very beginning, would do anything for Prim. And she would do anything to save Prim's life. She saves Prim's life, especially in the books, dozens of times. She keeps saving Prim's life over and over and over again. And yet, in the end, spoiler alert, if you guys don't know, skip ahead 10 seconds, she dies. Prim still dies. And so it's extra emotional emphasis there because we're feeling like, yeah, the Capitol's bad, yeah, the rebels are kind of bad, they're not doing it in the best way, but like things are getting figured out, right? And then you're like, the rebels would do anything to prove their point, including kill their own people. And that's when you're like, if they'd just been like, they killed their own people, you'd be like, oh, that's so sad. But the fact that Prim was a casualty, that's what makes it so that you go, oh my gosh, these are terrible people. Because of that emotional emphasis. It starts with her saving Prim's life, and she continues to save Prim's life, and ultimately there's nothing she can do but watch Prim die. And that sucks. But that's why it gives great, beautiful emotional emphasis, because it really drives that hammer fully in. And you fully feel that pain, that depth that you can't get in any other way, unfortunately. There's a lot of ways to do emotional emphasis, though. You don't always have to have a character die. Sometimes you just have to show realism. You don't have to go super dark to show realism either. You can do just light hints at things. For example, if you have a giant battlefield, you can hint at how many people are dead. You don't necessarily have to like gruesomely describe it, right? But you can be like, hey, lots of people died. And that will give more emotional emphasis because of the fact that you're not ignoring it. A lot of times the glorifying and the ignoring of deep emotional issues is what causes novels that feel funny. You know those novels that you read when you're like a kid and they feel great, and then you read them as an adult and you're like, why does this feel lame? The reason it feels lame is because they could have gone emotional, but they pulled back because they were too afraid of hurting the kids, which is good for small children, but not great for more adult writing. So if you're writing a young adult or an adult novel, keep in mind that you actually don't want to pull back from the dark too much. You don't want to completely go insanely gruesome and dark, but at the same time, you don't want to pull so far back that you're babying them. If you're writing for young adults and adults, don't baby them. We don't want to be babied. We want to be shown this is what reality is. And yeah, it sucks, but here's how the character's going to get through it. Here's how the character gets through the other side, even though there's so much pain going on. There's so much suffering going on. There's so many hard, difficult things going on. Heck, it can even just be a romance book with a really, really dramatic breakup. But have you ever read a romance book where like the breakup's so dramatic where you don't even know what they're breaking up over?
No.
And they're like, I don't want to be with you anymore. And you're like, why? You haven't stated a reason, bud. What is happening here? Why are you running off, girl? What's your problem? That happens sometimes in romance books because people assume they need the breakup in order to have realism. No, what you need is realism whether or not they break up. Some of the hardest times for a couple is when they haven't broken up and yet they still feel further away than ever. For whatever reason. Whether it's because they have disconnected or whether it's because one of them has lost a parent or family member and they don't know how to cope with their grief, and so the other person doesn't know how to connect with them anymore. So many reasons why this can happen. My point is, though, in order to get that emotional emphasis, what you need is realism. Not a certain plot structure, not a certain breakup moment in the romance, not a certain specific character death. What you need is realism, whatever that looks like. I will say, if you are doing a war, though, people do have to die. At least one of the characters that matters needs to die, because of the fact that otherwise it doesn't feel real. The likelihood that a group of like 10 people would all go into war and all come out alive is possible,
It's happened.
but not very likely. Exactly.
It's happened.
It's happened for sure, but at the same time it's not very likely. I would say at bare minimum, if you're going to have them all come out alive, make sure one of them suffers a severe injury and you question if they're going to die. Because honestly, no one comes out unscathed, at the very minimum.
True, but like there have been conflicts and battles where
No,
like
for
really
sure.
one side had like no casualties.
No, for sure. I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm just saying 90% of the time that's not the case. So you want to make sure you show semi-realism, at least by having injuries. And you gotta at least have someone get injured. If everyone doesn't sustain a single injury, you gotta have some sort of fantasy reason to explain that. Because they at least should be injured, and maybe one of them die. I do say maybe. Like you said, it's possible that they all live. But I would say at least consider it. And then if you decide no, none of them are gonna die, then at least do some sort of really intense injury where they're like, are they going to die? Then they don't. Just because of the fact that that helps address some of the realism. There have been so many people that have gone to war and lost friends. So many people. And so to them, that would be really hard to read a book where it's like, oh, and they all go to war, and they're like, oh no, some of their friends are going to die, and then they all live. That's the moment when they go, put the book down. Unless you make the stakes high. Like I said, you have someone get incredibly injured, and then they miraculously live. Then the person's like, I'm cheering for you. I don't want your friend to die, right? But if you just are like, they all don't even get a scratch, despite the bullets flying at their faces, you're like, okay.
I guess like you said it to be like, semi-realistic, but like
Mhm.
how about we mean like things like logic, like certain things that like aren't logically realistic? Because
Yeah.
I remember I saw this video about like this whole thing about if you light a cigarette but like on the filter it becomes sharp.
Mhm.
And there's this guy basically mentioned that his book had it, and a bunch of people were saying like, oh, that isn't realistic, when it actually is. That's not a thing you do.
Mhm.
And I think that's one thing to go into.
Is it that, yes, when I talk about realism, I'm talking more about logical. That is good to clarify. Because a lot of times realism is actually stranger than fiction. People will read a fictional novel and, like you said, be like, that's total crap, and then you look it up and you're like, actually it's not. And so it's kind of funny because you have to think logically, I would say. Logical is a good example for that. And honestly, realism is a good example too, because like I said, sometimes it is weird. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. I will say though, your editors will probably get on you if it makes too little sense, even if it's realistically possible, because of the fact that a lot of times realism is so crazy that we can't believe it if we see it in fiction, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's nonetheless the case. So I would definitely say yes, logicism or logicalness is a good way to go. If you're thinking, hey, logistically what would happen, that's a good way to almost always guarantee that you have a good outcome and that your reader doesn't get confused. Sometimes weird things happen in reality, for sure. I have experienced my fair share of bizarre happenings in reality.
Literally just right for me.
Yeah, so like weird things can happen, for sure. I'm not saying weird things can't happen. I'm just saying if you stick with at least 85% logic, then I would say when the realistic moments come in that are weird, then it's more likely to believe it because of how highly logical it is, if that makes sense. It's harder to believe it if everything's weird, but it's easier to believe it if it's 85% logic and then, the rest is kind of thrown in realism, crazy wackiness. It kind of makes it a little bit more palatable for a reader. I don't know why that is, if I'm being honest. It's kind of funny that way. Readers are bizarre like that, but it is the case. All right. Moving on to the next topic. So, with resonance, you're also going to want to consider world building, especially if you have a fantasy magic system or a science fiction doohickey.
What about alt history?
You mean like historical fiction?
Like, I mean, like alt history, like for example, like the world is still pretty normal, but there's like one like historical thing that's kind of off. Like for example, a popular one I see a lot is like the Soviet Union still exists. Even
Oh
after
yeah,
the
so you mean
90s.
alternate history?
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the one.
yeah. So with alternate history, I would say that's also even more pivotal for resonance because of the fact that you are extrapolating if this then that, right? And so that resonance is going to be even more impactful, especially with things like the Soviet Union or the Nazis won or things like that. I've seen alternate histories like that too. Generally, if you're doing alternate history, make sure that your world building is strong. Make sure that you do a ton of research about that time
the
period,
thing about that,
and
I
that you
mentioned
have it solid.
because I bring that up because of Chainsaw Man. I'm just not really familiar with that.
Not sorry.
Okay, but like to be honest, like the backdrop, like the whole, I say it's all history because in this world, like the Soviet Union still exists even after '91.
Yeah.
And I disliked it because it does nothing interesting with that. Cause
Right. The world building didn't feel
like that's a
important.
personal peeve I have with like a lot of like these stories I see where they say stuff like, oh, like the Soviet still exists even though they don't do anything with that.
Yeah.
Even though like there has to be a lot of
Yes.
stuff behind you.
Don't
Why does it
include
still
stuff
exist?
if you're not going to. Thank you. Yes. That is important for resonance too. If you include it in your world building, it needs to be important to the story. If it's not important to the story, delete it.
Which that's the thing is about Chainsaw Man. I do
Mhm.
think it's good, but
Yeah.
its world building is just terrible.
Yeah.
Like
And that can really bother readers, as you're talking about. You're like, come on, it was a good story, but that is bothering me.
which
Yeah.
it does matter with a lot of stuff because in this story, you know, there's devils, they actually
Mhm.
exist, and what devils can do is that they can rewrite, you know, historical events. Because
Mm.
in Chainsaw Man's universe, the last war ever fought between humans was World War One.
Mm.
But like the thing is, it does acknowledge that if you know a devil changes a historical thing, all this stuff that came out of that historical event is going to stop existing.
Mhm.
So like I kind of think World War One being the last war ever fought means that you know a bunch of you know
Would be
technologies and
drastically
whatnot
different.
would not
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
Which is very logical because like hey, why the heck do helicopters still exist? Because you know those stopped developing because of World War Two, but you know the last war that got fought was World
Yep.
War One. So
Precisely. Thank you. I very accurately put. You got to make sure with your world building that things make logical sense. That you don't just say, "Hey, okay, so we have this magical type of grass, and if you eat it, you get magic powers." But for some reason, no one has bothered actually, you know, putting any sort of laws on this or regulations or
'cause, like,
concerns.
I mentioned that because and further into the comic, you know,
Yeah.
one of the chapters is that like basically I forgot what it was, but something about dairy not exists anymore. So that means you know no more ice cream, no more pizza.
Right.
That character is actually really phased by that,
Mhm.
which again is like, hey, if that means you know stuff stops existing because of a historical event, how you know how come you know all this stuff still exists?
Right, how
despite
come all
that?
the other stuff still exists? Right, like the things changing versus the things not changing wasn't balanced, it sounds like. Yeah, that can definitely happen in a unfortunately clunky world build. And you want to make sure that a story really resonates with the reader when it is logistically focused. We like logic, even in our fantasy universes. Now that might, for those of you who are fantasy readers on the video and otherwise, that might be annoying to hear that we want some logic in our fantasy, but we do. We don't want you to be like, everyone has the ability to fly except for suddenly no one can fly for no reason. You're like, okay, what? We need a reason here. You can't just throw things out there because it's convenient for you, even if it's fantasy or science fiction. So you gotta make sure with your world building, if it's gonna resonate with your readers, you gotta make sure it's well built, that it logically makes sense, that what happens in the story follows a good pattern of forward movement with time and space and fantasy. Make sure that if you have fantasy, it has rules. Rules are actually important to your fantasy world building, believe it or not. Alright, now we're going to talk about character building themes. we already kind of addressed this a touch earlier. Let me scroll down to make sure I have the rest of my stuff. We already discussed a little bit of character earlier. But with character building themes, you want to make sure that your character doesn't fit perfectly in this universe. And you want to make sure that they're not too overpowered. The reason why overpowered characters do not resonate with readers is because they're just like, I am so perfect and my only flaw is I have freckles. And you're like, that what? Pardon? Like, that doesn't resonate, right? Because we're all people. We all have flaws. We all make mistakes. We all have struggles. It's okay to have someone be very powerful, yeah. But if they're going to be very powerful, you need to also neutralize that power somehow. A weakness, a point of contention, a flaw in their character. And when I say flaw in their character, I mean integrally flawed. A big problem, not just, like I said, I have freckles, and therefore this society thinks I don't look pretty, which I think freckles look great, I'm just making stuff up. But you want to make sure that it's not a superficial flaw. You want to make sure that it's something that is actually going to affect them in their daily life. A great example of a debated, overpowered character is Superman, right? He has freaking laser eyes, he can fly, he's bulletproof, all the things. And yet his only real flaw is that he has serious emotional turmoil about being a hero. He's constantly like, I want to save everyone, and you're like, you can't save everyone, and he's like, watch me. That's his only flaw, really, but it does work. Why? Because as a hero, that is a big problem. Thinking you can fix everything when you really can't. As a hero, there's a lot you have to let go. There's a lot you have to realize you just can't control. Doesn't matter how many fancy superpowers you have, some things you just can't control. You just can't do. And so in some ways, I think that's what makes him so likable as a superhero, in spite of being overpowered, is the fact that his flaw is something that no other superhero really has, right? They all want to save everyone, but ultimately they all realize they can't.
Hello, characters. I love these guys.
So,
Right,
what's
it's
going
so
to make
much
a
fun.
character actually have resonance is going to be relatability, above all. Do they feel like they could be a genuine, real person, and they have genuine, real flaws that are going to affect their everyday life? Another thing that is going to help us relate to characters is if they do not have a perfect life and if they don't quite fit in the role. Now, this is where you get the reluctant hero. A lot of people see the reluctant hero, right? Now, the reason why is because of the fact that it's more relatable. Because how many of us have jobs or things that we don't want to do, but we know we have to, right? How many of us have chores and stuff that we're like, we do that
Waking up in
tomorrow,
the
but you also
morning.
can't do that tomorrow. Or you don't want to get up in the morning, but you have to because you have to go to school. Yeah,
Getting
feeling
ahead.
that one right now. But point being, with characters, you gotta have a little bit of reluctance. If they're fully just like, yes, I want to be a superhero, there might actually be something wrong with them. Because no one actually should want to be a superhero. To want to save people, yes, 100%. If you want to save people, amazing, that is
Yeah.
good. But
Props.
what becomes weird is when you say, I want to be a hero because I just want the powers. That's when you go, okay, buddy, that's a problem.
That's when you have a villain.
Exactly, that's when you start going, you're leaning into anti-hero villain territory, aren't you? So with your characters, especially if they are going to save the day and it's not just a romantic interest or something like that, you want to make sure that they have a little bit of reluctance if they are actually the hero. If they aren't the hero, by all means have them be like, power, mwahaha. But if they are the hero, they should be a little bit reluctant and a little bit not quite fitting and a little bit doesn't quite work. A great example of this is actually Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. I'm not a super huge fan of everything that J.K. Rowling does, but I will say what I liked about it was the characters she chose for that series. Because this guy who is socially awkward has to fight for the rights of animals by actually interacting with people. So you have to interact with people, but also have no idea how to do it. That makes a problem, right? And then his best friend is a baker. He has no idea what he's doing. He just knows that bread and sugar equals yummy. That's also a problem, right? But that's what makes them such lovable characters, because the whole time you're going like, they're gonna screw it up, but also I care about you.
Don't screw it up, don't screw it up. I love you, but don't screw it up.
Don't screw it up, but also when they do, you're like, of course they did.
My siblings.
You're like, I saw it coming, but I didn't want to see it coming.
Siblings can do nothing.
So, with building a character that resonates with your readers, you gotta make sure that they have some flaws and have some reluctance and issues that they come across. Next thing are physical themes. Now, with physical themes, these are gonna be things like metaphors. And this can be really fun to play with. You don't have to do this, but metaphors can be really fun to work with. I was watching a show the other day that had a really interesting but terrible metaphor, where this guy can see into the past and the future. He's kind of psychic in a way.
Same.
And he goes to see into the past to help reunite two people who had lost contact over the years, right? And he's starting to feel like, this kind of sucks, because these two people that I'm trying to reunite remind me exactly of this other situation that I dealt with in my past. And the fact that those two people got to get, that guy got together with the girl I really wanted to marry and be with. And so he's kind of sitting there like, I kind of don't want these two to get together, because I feel like this other guy who really, really liked her and didn't really have a chance didn't get a chance, you know? And so he ends up at the very end of the show sitting on the bench with the guy who didn't get a chance with the girl, kind of going like, well, this sucks, we both didn't get a chance with the girl. Exactly. But it was a physical metaphor, because he actually had to physically sit with this guy who was exactly like him in a lot of ways, and had made a lot of the same mistakes that he had. And so with physical things that are a part of your story, don't go too heavy with metaphor. That much I will say. Big caveat warning. If you're doing resonance, be careful of metaphor. Metaphor can be a very powerful, gorgeous tool that makes you go like, mwah, beautiful. But it can also be a tool that makes people go, oh gosh, this is the 700th metaphor in the last chapter. So too much metaphor can get your reader a little bonkers. But it can also be a very powerful tool. For example, movies honestly do a great job of this, but especially the most recent Into the Spider-Verse movie. A lot of Gwen's emotional status is depicted by color in the background. Yes, and that is a metaphorical thing. That is something that the first time you watch it, you probably won't even notice, because it's just enhancing of the situation. But then when you rewatch it, you're like, oh, and it's like extra cool.
What if you weren't paying attention and you noticed it?
That could be cool
I'm
too.
like a
Good
big,
job.
Because like, I mentioned that
Yeah.
in this movie I saw like I think last week,
Mhm.
where I had so that's what that meant, but then I realized, they actually did show that, but I just didn't notice it.
Right? That can happen too, where you're just like, wait, what? And then later you're like, I get it now. Yeah.
I'm
so,
like a big story nerd. I love like using colors and stuff to like
yeah.
do emotions. So I noticed that, and so did my brother, and I was
Yes.
like, yes, I'm not the only one.
Yeah, so having physical things in your novel, like for example, you can set a mood of a scene just based on your descriptor words, right? We've discussed this before, but I think it's worth repeating. This can have a physical resonance on the scene, you know?
Oh God,
If you
by the time
describe
that's over.
a Victorian mansion as looking lonely and forgotten, then you're going to give a forgotten, lonely feel. Or if you say, hey, the big wrought iron gates were intimidating, that's going to give us a scared feel. If you say the big wrought iron gates, like, almost seemed to flow in ebony waves, that gives us an elegant feel, you know? You can describe the exact same object different ways, and that'll give us a different emotional resonant feel. So keep that in mind too. make sure that when you describe things, you're not like, the sun shone happily and I'm depressed. Like, you can do that if you want to like show the contrast and say like,
Yeah, if you want to be like, the sun was mocking me with my happiness.
exactly, the sun was mocking me with
Someone please use that in a story, actually.
Yes. Like, the sun was mocking me because I'm so depressed today. Like, that's amazing. But if you just say like, it's super sunshiny like my attitude, and then you have them crying, you're like, either they're being sarcastic or they messed up.
Edit, please.
So make sure the physicality is not overused, but that if you do use it, you can spice it up a little bit. Use it liberally, but not too liberally. All right. Now we addressed this a little bit, but I feel like it's worth repeating a little bit because we only touched on it. We didn't really dive deep into it. Don't avoid hard topics. A lot of people end up sounding like a children's book author because they're avoiding hard topics on purpose. Thousands of people have died and yet no blood is shed. Just squints.
Wait, hold up.
Right? Or, hey, their significant other broke up with them and they are just fine. Unless they were a toxic, terrible person, you're probably not fine.
Yeah, no.
Like, and even if they were a toxic, terrible person, sometimes if they are emotionally manipulative enough, you still miss them, even if you shouldn't. So don't avoid hard topics. I can understand, especially as teenagers and young adults, wanting to avoid hard topics because you're like, what if I don't write it right?
Yeah, that's what the thing is. What if you don't write it well and it just comes out as incredibly just like, I don't know.
Better
it's
to
like,
try.
What you
Because
do
of the fact that you can edit it later. If you avoid it altogether, it comes off even worse than if you tried and fixed it and edited it later.
You can also like talk to people who have like gone through that.
Also
just
true.
to see like,
hmm
how did you cope with this? You know?
How do you cope with this?
Like-
Talk to people, do some research.
Yeah.
And then
like, the
if
thing
you
I'm
still
thinking about,
struggle,
like, I'm pretty sure no one has gone through it, so.
oh, I see. Feel free.
This is where an imagination comes into play. There's this thing called a writer's instinct, and it's going to be your best friend.
This is fair. Writer's instinct is a good friend. Good friend. Don't ignore your gut. Your gut is usually
Yeah.
right. There have actually been times where I didn't do any research on a topic. I wrote with my instinct and then was like, I'll fix it later. And then I've had people read it. I actually did this recently, where one of my friends and we wrote a story where the person had PTSD. We both didn't do any research. We were just like, let's finish the story and then we'll fix it later, right? And we both followed our instinct. We just went with it. And then she had a friend read it who had PTSD. And she said, you didn't do any research? Like, confused.
Wait, hold up.
Like, this feels good. So, writer's instinct is helpful. However, if you are concerned about it, like, go ahead. Tell me. Like, what's your concern?
You want me to say what I mentioned? Okay.
Go ahead.
So, this comes from the game Metal Gear Solid 5. I'm not sure if you've played it before.
I haven't. Sorry. I
But-
play some video games, but not a lot.
But basically, the topic there is the language virus, which gets released by Skullface. And basically, what this virus does is it infects someone who speaks a certain language, and the language is English.
Yeah.
So of course, it's like this theory. Basically, it's a disease that kills people, blah blah. And I guess I should summarize where their base of operations is. They're off the coast of South Africa. They live on oil rigs.
Mhm.
And off this offshoot, one in the far distance, where they basically have this virus contained. The
Yeah.
outbreak happens.
Yeah.
And so boss gets sent in to contain it. And while he's there, I
Mhm.
just like what I find really funny is that I wanted to play the game, which is kind of have a fun time. But then this
Yeah.
mission came up. It
Mhm.
was also incredibly scary because when you enter the building, it's very dark, it's very dimly. And as
Set the
you
mood.
start to go through,
Yeah.
you start to see people like irrational, like shooting at you. And then as it starts to go down, like, oh, everyone's infected, you realize objectives, start to kill everyone there. And, these are the people you recruit into your military.
Yeah.
And it's pretty messed up because, like, on this side, you see a little saying, like, oh, this person joined one eye. Because, like, when you recruit someone, their name appears on the side.
Mhm.
So as you're killing them, it's saying, like, oh, you killed them, you have now negative karma. So you're just
Mhm.
going through the facility, killing everyone. And I guess one aspect of it is because, like,
Yeah.
the objective is to, get to the roof because, like, the virus, making people want to get to the roof. So when they die, it infects the crows, those crows spread the virus around. So you're just, trying your best to go up there. And I think, if I remember vaguely, some did get out, but then, like, I think there was a helicopter, like, sends, like,
So
a rocket
what's
towards
the
it.
issue with description?
I guess I should say is that it's very horrifying having to, kill people that you recruited as your own.
Yeah.
And at the end, the whole moral accusation is brought up because, like, you killed your own people.
Mhm.
And after, Boss seems to be unfazed by it because he thinks what he did is righteous.
Mhm.
Well, I guess I shouldn't say righteous because he views what he did as pretty negative because he had to kill his own people.
Right. Negative, but for a positive reason.
Yes, to make sure that virus doesn't,
Yeah.
infect
I would
the rest of the
actually
world.
say I can understand why you think no one's gone through that, but lots of people actually have. That's the sad part about reality, is that I can guarantee you there are lots of people out there
Like,
that
I'm
have
gonna
killed
be
their
real.
own people.
I explain it in a
for
terrible
good
way. It's
reason.
better to experience it
But
for yourself.
I'm just saying I can see why you think you're like no one would do that, right? There are people who probably have done that for whatever reason, whether it's because they believe they betrayed them or whether it's because they were ordered to by the military, and if you go against the military, you're done. And so there have actually been people who have been like, yeah, go kill your compatriot or else. And I've actually had to do things like that. So I would say, first of all, research is still going to be valuable. A lot of things, even if they are fantasy related, you can find realistic counterparts. So maybe not quarantine specific situations, but like I said, a betrayal, or you don't know who the betrayer is, so they say kill them all, or different things like that. There have been instances like that in war for sure.
Or just like PTSD from having to kill someone mixed
Yep.
with like the feeling of like being betrayed.
Also
That's
fair.
how I would tackle it.
Yeah, that's also fair. Even just regular warfare would tear into you because Civil War would also be a great example of something you could do,
definitely.
because there were so many people who, like, their brother was on the other side of the Civil War, and yet they believed what they were doing is right. At any second, they could have shot their own brother in the face, but they believed what they were doing is right, and that it was okay. And so I would say, if that is genuinely a concern of yours, Civil War would be a great place to start. War in general is a great place to start, especially PTSD, because people do get PTSD from killing other people, whether or not they're relevant to knowing them. I would also say, if you're doing any sort of like fantasy or science fiction virus, definitely read a lot of fantasy and science fiction that have quarantines and viruses in them. Because of the fact that the more you read about those kinds of things, the better your imagination will be at figuring out its own unique version. For example, if you want to write a military sci-fi, I highly recommend reading a ton of military sci-fi.
Ender's Game.
Ender's Game example.
Start with Ender's Game.
What
It's
is
so
that?
good.
It's a really good one. It's by Orson Scott Card.
You haven't read it?
And what is it about?
Well, it is a militaristic sci-fi. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you want, you can just do it.
Yeah, so
it's
Ender's
been
Game-
like 6 years since I've read it.
It's pretty much about this guy who gets like kind of drafted into this like military school. He's 6, by the way. And so he gets drafted into this like whole military school, and the teachers make the other classmates like hate him because he's special. They see something special in him. He's going to be like this next big leader. And why they need next big leaders is because there's this like alien race that are like super powerful. They can like read each other's minds, they think, and so like communication is super quick, and
As a result, they are incredibly hard to defeat, obviously.
yeah, there have been 2 like invasions of the buggers, I believe, or at least 1, and like a bunch of people died, like a whole ton of people died. The only reason that they like won the second one is because of this like big commander dude who was like genius, pulled a stunt, won the war, right? And so Ender goes to the school. He's doing pretty well, but like there are a lot of people who don't like him. And then he like goes to like the command school and does well. Ends up winning the war, and it's so good. I'm not
really
doing
good.
it justice,
Yeah.
but like it's
Long
so
story
good.
short, alien war in space, lots of military stuff because of
Yeah.
the fact that it's a military school that he's going to
And
in
so
order
like
to be trained for
12-year-old
this.
kid.
Yeah. Yeah. So
On
long
top of
story
mine, I
short.
can think of like the other like military sci-fi stuff I guess I consume is Halo, Starship Troopers, and Killzone.
Also good ones. Also all good ones for sure. In general, though, I would say whatever you want to write, find things that are similar to help inspire you. The best writers read because that is the best way to learn what it should look like, so that way you can try and mimic it yourself. With your
Yeah.
own story.
Also, with the whole like killing your own people, it's not exactly the same, but like Endo's game has a great.
That is true.
it's
He has a lot of grief and stuff that he
Mhm.
has to deal with,
Yeah.
which is very, very good.
So
I gotta
good.
say. Very good. He does
best
a good job.
science fiction book ever written, in my opinion.
Anyway, point being, don't avoid hard topics, even if you don't know how to write them, because of the fact that it is better to write them and then get an editor. That's the real key here, is get an editor. Because a lot of people are like, oh, well, don't write it if you don't know how to write it if you are self-publishing without an editor. True. If you are self-publishing and you
Or
aren't
if you
hiring
are
an
the
editor, yeah, and you aren't hiring an editor, and when I say you aren't hiring an editor, I say that even for myself. I am an editor, and I will be hiring my own editor because you are biased.
Yes.
So you should be hiring another person to be your editor if you're self-publishing. Period. I'm
what if
sorry.
everyone's too nice? Because that's one thing I'm actually kind of worried about. Is like I think it's gonna be too nice to me. Like no one's gonna be.
If
like,
you hire an actual professional editor, it's their job to be creatively critiquing you, and if they are too nice to you, find someone else.
Okay.
You can actually do that because or at least
Cheyenne
with
is
me.
really good.
Thank you. I am a professional editor, yes.
And she's like nice about it and
I
respectful.
am. I
and,
don't
she
like
likes what
punch you
you're
in the
writing.
face.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's great. You, Cheyenne.
I will also not like punch you in the face, but at the same time I will be real with you.
Yeah,
I'll be
no,
like,
absolutely.
hey, if this isn't good, I'll tell you it's not good. But I will say you can get sample edits. If you are self-publishing, you want to make sure to get a sample edit from a bunch of different editors first, and then pick the one that you feel fits best, both with your writing style and is going to not be too easy on you. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like personality-wise, because there are a lot of
And
different
personality.
personalities
Oh,
of,
for
like,
sure.
editors and writers. And if your guys'
Mhm.
personality doesn't mesh, then you're not going to have a good
Yeah.
writing experience.
That is the one hard thing about traditional publishing is you don't get to pick the editor. You just give it to the company and they assign you one, which is great because it means it's free. But also,
What if they could be bad?
sorry?
What if they could be bad? You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or they could just not fit with you. Or they could just not feel good or not be as great of an editor. I will say, yeah, generally that can happen for sure. I actually went to LTUE last year. Funnily enough, not this year, last year. And there was one person who said they actually requested an editor change halfway through with the company. Because you are allowed to request, doesn't mean they'll say yes, but you are allowed to request, especially if you have a list of reasons. And she sent her list of reasons and actually got a new editor because she was like, she missed this plot hole. She told me to change this about the character that doesn't need to be changed. She didn't get the edits to me on time. She took a whole extra month. And so
Dang.
and so as a result, by the time she was done, they were like, yeah, we'll give you a new one. But generally, that is not the case unless it's like that, where it's like, they're really bad. I will say traditional is a great way to go if you don't know how to market. If you don't know how to market your novel, do not self-publish because you have to market it all by yourself or hire a marketer. And let me tell you right now, marketers are expensive. You won't be able to.
What if you want to like? Okay, so like one thing I've always kind of had is that what if you just do it like word of mouth? You just kind of release it and just kind of let people do it for you.
I can totally understand what you're saying. Sorry. The reason I'm laughing is because you sound exactly like my husband when he self-published. It doesn't work. Long of the story of the short, it doesn't work. You'll sell about 10 copies
What
and
if,
that's
okay,
it.
but like the thing is, I'm not trying to consider it selling. Like to be honest, I don't really care if my book sells or not because
Yeah.
if people like it.
Yeah.
If you don't really care about like
Yeah.
how much you sell,
Yeah.
then what you could do is just like hop on social media and get
Yeah.
some like focus groups and like, hey, if you guys like this,
That'd
I've
be
got
my
a new book coming out.
recommendation.
I'm really hoping you'll like it. Please check it out.
Advertise
You know?
it on social media. That's going to be better than physical word of mouth because of the fact that physical word of mouth fizzles out very fast nowadays. Whereas you put a video on the internet, it sticks forever.
Yeah, and people can like share it.
Yeah,
and, like,
people
get
can
the same
share
message
it,
across,
people
other
can
than, like,
look across it. Yeah, the algorithm can recommend it to people. So
Yeah.
I would say generally, if you're going to self-publish, hop on social media. If you're not terribly concerned about your sales, then I would say post once a week and be like, hey, this is what's in my book. This is what my character's like. It's cool.
I know, because like the thing is that I would imagine that whatever you make, some people are gonna find. You're gonna like develop like a niche group around it.
I can understand what you're thinking, but the main problem is that with self-publishing, generally you'll publish via Ingram or Amazon. I know there's others, but they're just not as superior. With Amazon, the main problem is that when you first publish, you will be top 25 on the page for Amazon. So they still have to scroll to the bottom, but you'll be there because you're a new release. Then about 2 weeks after you're a new release, you go straight to 5,503. And so finding your book is going to be almost impossible. It is really the hardest part about self-publishing is trying to get yourself from the bottom of the Amazon list to semi close to the top, because of the fact that when people scroll, it is actually a known fact that people generally don't scroll on Amazon or any sort of search pages for books for more than maybe 7 seconds. That means your book at the very bottom is not going to get
'cause,
seen.
The thing is that when I search for books, like I'm gonna be real, I've never bought books online. Most
Yeah.
of them are just through bookstores, so you know.
That's another thing. I will say if you self-publish, you're going to want to make sure that you hire a book cover designer and hire an editor, especially if you're relying on bookstores, because they will not take your book unless it looks professional, inside and out. Which is the really hard bit, because covers generally cost anywhere from $200 to $500. But if you do not get a professionally designed cover, they will not take it. Bookstores will go, sure, we'll take it, and they'll take one copy and then purposely ignore you. Just because of the fact that they want to keep high quality books. It's a judgment thing, unfortunately. It really is. Like, people shouldn't be so judgmental about book covers, but they really are. I've experienced it myself.
Yeah, same.
They're very picky and judgy about what things look like, which is weird because we always talk about don't judge a book by its cover, but do we actually
literally everyone
believe
does.
that? Yeah, no, everyone
I mean,
does.
that's kind of
Book,
the point of a
book
book,
covers,
though.
like at this point, book covers are made to be judged.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just true.
I
But
know,
anyway.
like, what if you do something to grab
Yeah.
someone's attention? Like, let's say, for example, like the book cover is completely blank. It's just white. That's gonna get someone's attention. It's blank.
Yeah, it's going to get their attention, but in the wrong way. If it's completely blank, then they're going to look at it, they're going to flip open the first page maybe, or they're just going to look at it and go, I don't know what genre that is, scary.
I think
Because
it also depends on your style. Because if you're going
Yes.
kind of like a psychological thing,
Yeah.
and it's have like a white, just like a white
Yeah.
cover with like the title in like small print, that's enticing.
oh, for sure, if you're doing like a psychological thriller.
Yeah.
But even then, I would say psychological thrillers have a certain look to their cover, and you're going to get more people if you do a professional cover, because of the fact that professional covers are also meant to show you what genre it is. So as a result, for example,
That's
if you have
interesting.
a cartoony, cutesy cover, people are going to think romance. So if it's a horror,
But I think that's a good thing.
that's a bad thing,
Well, I
because
think
it
it'd be
means
good
that
because
it
it
means
could
that
make
you're getting the
people
wrong
see.
audience.
Well, like something else could find it, because like my whole deal is that I don't really care about sales or any of that. It's
Oh,
just
yeah.
I want to find an audience, because some people will like that.
No,
and
yeah.
I think that's what matters. Find people who truly like your work.
And I totally get that. I'm just saying, if you want to find your real audience, they need to be able to find you easily. Because the one problem in today's society is there are so many books that you have to be able to catch their attention like that. And the best way to do that is book covers. So I can see what you're saying, for sure. I can totally see what you're saying, but the best way to get your audience is to get them to know what they're looking at. So if you're like, hey, this looks like a romance book, and then it turns out to be a horror book, you're going to have a ton of pissed off romance readers who are
Yeah.
going to review your book and be like, this sucks because I thought it was a romance.
But like
And
hey,
that's not good.
negative PR is still good for you because they'll get people interested.
If you're not self-published, yes. If you're self-published, you go straight to the bottom. Even worse than before. I have seen people who have gotten negative reviews as a self-published author, and they'll go from being like 25th in bestseller to being like 42nd in 2 days. So I can see what you're saying. Negative PR is still good PR when you're traditionally published. When you're self-published, negative PR can actually really damage you and your reputation as far as your novel goes. Self-publishing it's a monster, let's put it that way. It's doable, and I plan on doing it myself, but it is a monster of an effort to try and get done. Good to see you, Celia. So I can see what you're saying. Yes, you want people to judge your book based on your own merits, but you also want to make sure the right kind of people find your book. Because if the right kind of people find your book, then of course you're going to have an audience. But if you can't get the right kind of people to find your book, then you will have no audience.
Okay, but like, how about the opposite?
Mhm.
It's the wrong kind of people that are into your stuff.
Generally that's because of a book cover error. That's generally the biggest issue, and why I say the cover is important is because of the fact that, like I said, if it looks like a romance cover and then it's a horror, you're gonna get so many pissed off romance readers. But if it looks like a horror,
it turns out to be a romance.
then you'll also have pissed
Yeah.
off horror readers who are like, what the heck? But if you have a cover that looks like a horror and the book is a horror, that's how you find your audience.
Well, I don't know how long it goes, but I heard there's
Mhm.
a problem because a lot of horror books just have kind of covers, so it's kind of hard to tell if it's horror. Which,
Mhm.
honestly, I do kind of sort of that same issue. I've not seen too many horror books that make it very clear, the cover is horror.
Mm.
So
That
what I
is-
would do is like a dark color scheme.
Yeah,
Like, I feel
dark
like-
color scheme, generally red font of some sort.
Yeah.
I will say part of the problem is that it depends on what trend you're currently hitting with book covers too. For example, with fantasy right now, there's a huge trend of like daggers on the front cover, and there's a huge trend of like very angsty looking main characters.
That's
and
me!
And so if you don't like angsty looking main characters or don't like weapons on the front cover, then you're kind of
Oh, because I heard that's a problem with a lot of re-releases of classic
Mhm.
sci-fi books.
Yeah.
So, like the original covers from way back in the day is something very abstract,
Mhm.
and nowadays it's just something very poorly, like very minimal, like compared to like the previous covers. And that's something I
depends.
also do agree with, because like the
Mhm.
old covers for like a lot of classic sci-fi novels are just work of art, like very pretty, very
Mhm.
appealing.
Yeah.
And nowadays it's just kind of like
Yeah, unfortunately, that is part of a trend. It's part of a cover trend. That is the one good thing about self-publishing, is that you can work with, I would actually recommend Mibble Art. And I would recommend hitting them up on Black Friday because they actually have a 25% off deal that they do on Black Friday. So it's less expensive, still expensive, but still less expensive. And what Mibble Art does is they take your cover description and then help it to fit what the classic is for that cover. So for example, if you're like, hey, I want a fantasy book cover with these characters on the front and this is kind of the vibe I want, then you can also alter the cover too. So if you're like, I hate that font, you can tell them, I don't like that font. Can we change that font? And they will. That is the one good thing about Mibble. Not all cover designers do this, but Mibble is one place that actually will not have you pay until you are satisfied. And you can make as many changes as you want. And you can describe it as lengthy as you want. They tell you, like, give us as much description as possible about what you want for your book cover. So I would say if you're anxious at all about your book cover and your self-publishing, definitely hit up Mibble Art. It's spelled M-I-B-L Art. Mibble. I just affectionately call it Mibble because it sounds cute. But I would highly recommend them just because of the fact that, again, if your book cover doesn't look professional, bookstores won't take it, just flat out. Same thing with libraries. We've actually had people that have been like, hey, take my self-published book, and I've had to fight to get the book in, and sometimes still lost. Generally, I would say they take the book, and then if it doesn't do well in the first 2 years, they'll immediately take it out of circulation. Same thing with bookstores. They'll be like, oh, sure, we'll take your books, and then, like I said, they'll ignore you and not order anymore, which is just sad.
Yeah.
It's tragic. It's not okay. There's a lot of problems with the self-publishing industry that really peeve me. If you can tell, I'm very passionate and, like, it hurts to talk about for me because there are so many things where it's like, this is a beautiful book, but its cover isn't great, and therefore the author thinks that they're a bad writer, and that isn't true.
Yeah, because here's the thing about like a book cover. It's kind of like a promise that you're making to the reader. If it looks professional, they're expecting professional writing. If it's unprofessional, then they're not going to be expecting professional writing. It's going to look like an amateur's work, and so they're not going to pick it up.
Yep, which is just sad.
Yeah.
Again, people shouldn't judge books by their covers, but they do.
I mean, I do too.
Yeah, and so it makes me want to go cry.
Honestly, personally, I think I could do fine with that.
Mhm.
Just kind of makes sense professional because the thing you mentioned, like, oh, because they think it's good. Because I've been through bookstores and I've seen books like, I don't know about that one. Because I'm actually familiar with that writer and I just know that he's just awful.
No, yeah, that happens too. Where you're like the book cover, you're like, oh, that's interesting, and then you see who it's by, and you're like, oh.
No, because I
You.
think about this because when I was at Barnes and Nobles, I was in the
Yeah.
manga section, and there was this one book that I had
Mhm.
some interest in,
Yeah.
and I didn't know who the author was, so I just kind of let it go because like I had interest in it because like it looked like it was
Yeah.
horror, and that's what I'm into.
Yeah.
But like then I found out about this other manga, and this manga is very notorious for just being terrible.
Mhm.
And then I found out it was the same guy that
You're
wrote
the
that.
same guy, and you're
So
like,
I
oh,
dodged
no.
the bullet because I
Yeah.
almost got that book.
Exactly, because we're lured in by covers, whether or not it's good or bad. On the actual inside, we believe that if the cover's good, the actual product will be good on the inside, which is, yeah. I think that's honestly what frustrates me the most is where people are like, oh, self-published books aren't as good as traditional, and I'm like, that's not true. What you're thinking is the fact that there are just as many bad self-published books as there are bad traditional books. Everyone assumes that all traditional books are good, and I'm like, I've run into a lot of traditional books that, like you said, are actually pretty bad. So I think, but unfortunately, indie's under a lot of pressure to be perfect
Mhm.
because of the fact that there are so many that believe it or not. I think that's another hard bit that people run into is that they expect perfection, and if they don't get it, they get upset. Which again is unfair. Honestly, it's why I'm starting my own company. I'm starting my own company. The whole plan is that I will be reviewing independently published books, and then if they are thoroughly edited and thoroughly good, I will be like, listen, doesn't matter what the cover looks like, doesn't matter what the author's done, this is good book.
It's a fantastic
Because it's hard. It's hard.
But the rest of his books,
It's very
I
hard.
find that interesting because like I would say the standards are low for other media please and
Yeah.
like other medias like medias like for example like indie video games just have it a lot easier with other.
True.
And I think it's interesting to mention because like I think about like things like comics like I
Mhm.
cannot like name a single indie comic. I understand there's non-existent.
Pretty much.
Like do they even still exist?
They actually do. The only reason I know is because I've run into someone recently who does indie comics. But the reason that you don't know they exist is because they have no social media platform.
I guess it has a lot to do with the
So,
fact that
they exist. It's
specifically
just it's hard
American
to find.
comics have
Yeah.
been going through a lot.
Oh yeah, that's true too. So comic books are really definitely difficult too, especially.
I
But
don't know,
anyway.
because I think what's interesting about it is that
Mhm.
since like mangas are like really popular, even so much more popular than comics, and I
Mhm.
guess what you should say is that do you think it would be better to like maybe do manga rather than I guess American standard comics? But like I think what's something interesting to do is that
Mhm.
maybe you can have a lot more impact by making American comics because there's
Mhm.
a heavy shortage of it and people aren't interested in them. So like that's one thing I've been interested in is that if I ever do a comic, I'd probably do American comics because, like I said, there's a shortage of it.
And I'd recommend going traditional too, just because of the fact that, like you said, indie comics exist, but they are really few and far between, so
Like,
it's even
practically
harder to find you.
non-existent.
Yeah, they're practically non-existent, so they're really hard to find. With books, it's like indie books are actually becoming a much more popular thing now, whereas with indie comics, they basically don't exist. They exist, but they're
They're very,
basically
like,
they're
small.
almost extinct. Yes. But yeah, so I definitely say if you're thinking about comics at all, traditional is the route. All right, the last thing that I'm going to say regarding resonance, though, is sensory immersion. You want to make sure that you really make sure to, I'm tired, to hone in on detail, because if you don't have hyper, but when I say hyper detail, I don't mean too much detail, but I do mean you want to make sure you get at least the 5 senses, if you can. Obviously, taste is the one that you're like, don't have to do all the time,
Mhm.
but at the same time that doesn't mean you should avoid it altogether. If the opportunity arises, to go for it.
Yeah, don't go Brandon Sanderson on steroids. Don't go 5-year-old. You know?
Exactly. You gotta find some sort of a balance because if you don't have any description, then it's like I'm a white blob in a white room,
Yeah.
and you have problems. But if you also go crazier than Brandon Sanderson, good luck getting published because your novel will be this thick. So there's good pros and cons. All right, I'm going to turn off the video now. We can discuss whatever you guys would like though elsewise.